For over 40 years, SCM
has been the voice of our town,
bringing us together through local programming,
education,
and live broadcasts.
SCM isn't just about television.
It's about empowering our community,
ensuring our voices are heard during government meetings,
and celebrating milestones
like our high school graduations.
But today, SCM faces a challenge.
Our funding structure is based on television subscriptions.
And it's no secret, people have been cutting the cord.
With a shift to internet-only subscriptions,
SCM receives less revenue,
even though all our programming is freely available online.
We need your support.
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 Your donation can make a difference.
It will ensure that SCM remains open,
continues to educate our youth,
and keeps our community informed.
Thanks to SCM, I've been honing my creative skills, helping me work towards my college degree.
SCM is crucial for keeping our community connected.
SCM isn't just here to broadcast local events. They're actually preserving Simsbury's history.
Join us.
Join us in preserving Simsbury's voice.
Simsbury's voice.
Together we can ensure that SCM continues to thrive
for generations to come.
Visit our website
or scan the QR code on your screen to make your donation.
Every contribution
counts.
Thank you for supporting Simsbury Community Media,
where your town,
your schools,
and your government
come together.
All right, so we'll begin tonight. So this presentation is by Russell Blair. Russell is the Director of Education and Communications for the Freedom of Information Commission, managing the agency's training programs as well as answering questions from state and local officials, journalists, and members of the public about all things FOI. Before joining the FOIC, Russell spent more than a decade working in local journalism for the Record Journal American and the Hartford Courant. Immediately prior to joining the FOIC, Russell worked as Director of Communications and Marketing for Hartford Public Library. He is a graduate of UConn with a double major in journalism and political science, as well as being a lifelong Connecticut resident. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you for the introduction. So thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's a cold night. You could be cozied up at home. You could be doing a lot of other things, but you're here to learn about FOI. So that's always great. Whenever I do these presentations, and I do a lot of them, there's a couple things I always like to mention at the onset. The first is, there's my contact information, my email, my phone number. If there's an issue that comes up, whether it's, next week, next month, next year, you can always call us if you have a question about something, hey, what do we do with this agenda for this meeting? Can we do this in executive session or not? One of the things that I think is really helpful is, we do have 50 years, we'll talk a little bit about the FOI and the history, but this has been around for 50 years, the law. So a lot of issues that you may be grappling with, they may have come up in another community, and there might be a decision from the commission that can really give you a lot of important guidance, on how to handle a particular issue. So it's okay to ask questions, and also during the presentation tonight, usually the way I like to do it is as we're going, I'll stop a few times along the way and ask a question. But, if I say something and hey, that doesn't sound right, I'm not so sure, I think we might do it a different way, you could also raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you, as we're going through. So again, there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out in the future, if there's anything that we can do to help. I want people to know, not just you, but your other members of your boards and commissions, we are here available as a resource. Really, my job is to be the person in the state who can try to help you navigate FOI, who can answer some of these questions, and try to give you some guidance there. So just very briefly, I also think it's important to talk a little bit about the history of the Freedom of Information Act. As I stated earlier, if you didn't know, the law is celebrating its 50th birthday this year. So the FOI law passed back in 1975. And what you see up there on the screen is the preamble of the Freedom of Information Act, which was read on the floor of the General Assembly when they were passing the bill. Governor Grasso was the real champion who pushed and pursued to get the Freedom of Information Act passed. Interesting little factoid I heard this morning. So today was the opening day of the legislative session in Connecticut, and it's actually 50 years since Grasso was sworn in as the first female governor in the state of Connecticut. So 50 years ago, she became the governor, and in her first year in office, this was one of her priorities, and she pushed to see the passage of the Freedom of Information Act. And one other thing I think is important to know about Connecticut's law, if any of you have worked or lived in other jurisdictions, different states have Open records laws, they may call them different things. I think in New York, they call it FOIL, Freedom of Information Law. Some other states will call them sunshine laws or, public access laws. So other states have, freedom of information or public records laws. Most other states don't have a Freedom of Information Commission. So I think it's important we talk a little bit just about what the commission is and how that works. Essentially, when the law was created, they created the FOI Commission as an independent agency. We're part of the executive branch. But really what our job is our sole responsibility is to make sure that folks are following the FOI law, whether that's in cities and towns or state government. Police departments, boards of education, the law touches on anybody that has any aspect of government, providing access to their meetings and to their records. And what the FOI Commission really provides is it provides a tool, for people, if they feel like something wasn't done appropriately, they can bring a complaint to the commission. They don't have to have an attorney. They don't have to pay any filing fees. And so, when we go through everything tonight, I just want you to be thinking, really what we're trying to do here is, we want to do this right. One, because it's the law, we're required to do it. Two, we hope that you support the concept of the law. We want to have an open government. We want to have an informed citizenry. And three, really just practically speaking, you want to try to avoid FOI complaints if you can. And I don't say that because an FOI complaint is a big, scary process. Yes, potentially you could have to go to a hearing. The commission does have the ability to issue fines, although we don't do that too often. But what I find is an FOI complaint, it can eat up time, it can eat up resources, and sometimes complaints, it could have been resolved or it could have been avoided, if somebody took, half an hour and looked something up or called somebody or just stopped what they were doing for a minute and sought help. So I think that's really important. I would argue it's maybe even more important in Connecticut than in some other states that you do this work correctly because there's a really effective mechanism for people to bring complaints. Last year, we got 850 complaints across the state, between state and local government. So, we're a busy office, very active, and, just another thing to remember about why, it's important to do things correctly in terms of the Freedom of Information Act. So just a couple other basics, about the law before we get into some more of the details. There's really two parts of the law. It's about public access to meetings, and it is about public access to records. We're going to start today and spend, probably more time on the meetings piece because I understand a lot of you are on boards and commissions, so we'll go through that. We'll also touch too on records requests and what's required of you there. Just on this slide, a couple of things that I always just kind of mention at the start because, these are things that, sort of define, how the law works and how it operates. Really, with an FOI request, you're not required to conduct research or create new records that don't already exist. So an FOI request is, the law allows somebody to request copies of records or to review records that you have on file that you keep, that you maintain. So, if you're on a board or commission, this includes all the correspondence that you receive or send, any information that you get, in your meeting packets or agendas, all the information that you receive, in the course of your duties. And then, in town government, essentially, we'll talk about what a public record is, but if it deals with public business, it is a public record under FOI. But you don't have to create new records and you're not required to conduct research. So, the way I like to think of it is the people who request the information, they are still doing their own homework. Whatever they want to do with it is their business. The law doesn't, differentiate why somebody wants information. They don't have to tell you why they're seeking information. But again, it's just if you have it, you provide it. You're not required to create new records or do research. And then with meetings, one important thing I think to note is that, nowhere in the FOI law or really any other state statute is there anything that gives people the right to speak at public meetings. Now, you may have local ordinances or local rules that govern that, but from a statewide basis, the FOI Act is not about speaking at a public meeting. It is about attending a public meeting. So when boards and commissions have public comment, they are allowed to put restrictions on there. They can ask people to give their name and address. For example, if they want to speak, you could not, require somebody to write down their name and address to attend a public meeting. Anyone can attend a meeting. They are allowed to put conditions on speaking at public meetings. And as I stated, the Freedom of Information Commission, we really are the folks that come in and settle a dispute, through our complaint process. Whether somebody believes something went wrong with a meeting or somebody believes something went wrong with a records request, they file a complaint with us, and then we try to get to the bottom of what happened. And if we find a violation, we have some different powers. Like I said, we can issue fines. One thing I think is important to note for meetings, we don't do this all that often, but if ever there were a case where, something really egregious happened, the commission can nullify votes that were taken at one of your meetings. So if something doesn't happen correctly, the agenda was wrong, something was wrongly done in executive session, we could potentially wipe that out and say, you've got to go back and you've got to do it again properly. So just very briefly, I may have already mentioned this, public agency or agency. It's a little bit of jargon, but it's what the law uses to refer to really anybody who's covered by FOI. And the one important thing for boards and commissions, you see bolded in there, including any committee of or created by. So what that means is, if you have a planning and zoning commission and they create, maybe there's a subcommittee or there's a task force to look at the zoning regulations in a particular part of town. Sometimes towns will have like a village district and there might be a special group of folks who are going to look at, what the zoning regulations are in that district. If you create committees like that, they are also subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So it's not just your whole board, it's also any subcommittees that you create. If you create a building committee for a project or something like that, all those committees and boards and commissions are covered by the FOI Act. It doesn't matter what you call it. It doesn't matter, if you call it a working group or a task force. There's a legal definition of a meeting that we'll get into, and if it meets that definition, regardless again of what you call it, it would be a meeting under FOI. That last bullet is not really something you need to worry about too much here, but there are rare instances where nonprofits are covered under FOI if they serve a governmental purpose. Most commonly, I would say we see that probably with libraries. Libraries are often intertwined with town government, but sometimes they're, technically a 501c3, but because they receive funding from the town, because they're providing services to the town, because the town might have control over the library, if there's a library board or something like that, they're considered to be public agencies under the Freedom of Information Act. So that was just sort of, the primer, the beginning. So far, does anyone have any questions on anything we addressed? Okay. So now we're really going to kind of get into, some of the more specific details, and we'll start with meetings. And I don't know if any of you have ever found yourself in a meeting like this where, we're trying to figure out why we're having this meeting. Hopefully not. But a meeting under FOI, it's a pretty specific thing. And the way I try to think about it, and what you see there is the definition, right, from the statute, and a couple things in bold there that we'll go over. I like to try to explain it like there's three sort of triggers that you have to have for something to be a public meeting. So the first part, a hearing or other proceeding of a public agency or a convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency. So all your boards and commissions, the law refers to those as the multi-member public agencies. So the first thing we want to see is if we have a quorum of our multi-member public agency. That's sort of the first step. The second step is that they are either gathered, convened, or assembled, or they're communicating in person or by means of electronic equipment. So a meeting can be in person, a meeting could be electronically, a meeting could be over email, a meeting could be over text message. If it involves a quorum of board members, they're gathered or they're communicating. And then the last piece, they're discussing or acting upon a matter over which they have supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So for shorthand, I call that board business. So if we have a quorum of board members and they are either gathered together or electronically, and they are either communicating or discussing about things that are under their board business, then that is what makes something a meeting. So if any of you are new and unfamiliar with a quorum, it doesn't hurt to explain it. So a quorum is, a voting majority of your board. So if you're on a 7-member board, your quorum is 4. If you're on a 9-member board, your quorum is 5, and so on. So essentially, really what it comes down to is you don't want to have situations where we have a quorum or more of board members discussing board business outside of a public meeting. I'll talk a little bit about, where this comes up sometimes in the context of email, because that's a concern I hear from a lot of people. So what would be something you would want to avoid? Let's say, the clerk of your board sends the agenda out to all the board members. Here's the agenda for next week's meeting. You get all the items on there. You don't want to start, responding to that email, replying all, and starting a discussion about the items on there. Oh my God, this application from this developer, what is he thinking? We got to reject this. How could we stand for this? You don't want to start that dialogue and start those comments, because essentially what could happen is if there's a quorum or more of members that are in that discussion, sometimes I've heard people say, well, we're not voting on anything, right? We're not going to vote over email. We're just talking about it before the meeting. We're just discussing it. We're just seeing what everyone thinks. But if you have all that discussion preliminarily and it's all happening, over email or text message at the Dunkin' Donuts, when the people come to the meeting, they're not going to hear all that discussion. They may just see you guys up there and say, we're voting to reject the proposal, and there's no insight into how that's happening. So where it gets a little bit complicated is because of that piece about the quorum, that means that you can have discussions outside of meetings if it is less than a quorum. And there also are some exceptions to that, including caucuses, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So, if that's what you were thinking, hold that because we will get to caucuses. But you could have a situation, if we had a 9-member board, you could have 4 members and they could be from different parties. You could have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on a 9-member board. They could meet at Dunkin' Donuts and they could talk about what they think the board should do. And the reason there's a distinction there is because those 4 members, they don't have enough votes to get something passed. So even if they come up with a proposal and a plan and they say, we're going to kill the project and all that, they're going to have to come to the meeting and they're going to have to get a 5th person to agree with them to do that. So sometimes people ask, why is the quorum in there and sort of why, is that so important? And that's really the reason. So what this means, again, is, you also could have a scenario, and this would be appropriate. You have a meeting. This is probably very common. And at the meeting, they'll say, okay, Tim, Susie, and Bob, can you go look into what Avon is doing with their recycling and then come back to the next meeting and report out on that, and then we'll decide if we want to do something similar. They're going to go off, they're going to do their homework, they're going to do their research. They can work between board meetings in smaller groups like that because it's not a majority, it's not a quorum of the board. If you have a quorum, then you're not allowed to do those types of things. So just again, if it's a quorum and you're talking about board business, except for some examples we'll go over, then that's going to be a meeting. A couple other things, just sort of general ground rules for public meetings. I mentioned this kind of already, but anyone can attend a public meeting. You can set your own rules for public comment. The FOI law allows people to photograph, record, or broadcast public meetings. They don't have to seek prior permission, as long as they're not being, obstructive. They're not allowed to lean over the dais with their phone in your face, but if they're sitting in their seat in the audience or the back of the room or whatever, that's permissible. I always tell people I would hope you don't say anything at a public meeting that you wouldn't want recorded, but, just be on notice that somebody could be recording you. And then we'll talk more in detail about this in a second, but agendas, agendas need to fairly apprise the public of what will be discussed at a meeting. And I just think it's important sometimes because, as board members, you have intimate details and knowledge about all these things that are going on at your board or commission. You want to remember the agenda is really for the public. So you want to make sure the agendas are clear, so even if somebody is not following every move of the board, they're understanding, what's going to happen at a particular meeting. So does anyone have any questions on that, on the definition of a meeting, on when electronic communications could become a meeting, emails, text messages, any questions on that? Okay, sure.
Question as to whether the composition of the separate group, there's like a informal thing that might be deemed a meeting. Does it matter what the composition is? If you have a board that has officers, and there's no officers participating in this.
So it would really come down to the number. So if it's not a quorum, it's not a meeting. So you could have you could have a meeting of just the officers of the board, and that presumably is not a quorum, so they could meet as just the officers, or the people who are not the officers could meet. It's really about a quorum. It's not about anybody's individual role on the board. Okay, so we kind of already talked about this, but email and meetings, just be careful again, because the definition of a meeting in our law is whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. So emails and text messages could constitute meetings. It's okay to discuss administrative type things, scheduling matters. Somebody has something they would like to see added to the agenda. Another example I think is important to mention too. It's really about a back and forth discussion. So one member can send an email to the whole board. If you got a letter from somebody in town and you wanted to share it with your board members, hey, somebody wrote me this letter about this issue, you could share the letter. But if you want to discuss it, what we need to do in response to this, then that would be where you would want to do it at the meeting. So, you could share a communication, you could share a newspaper article, you could ask, request something be added to the agenda, you can schedule a special meeting, over email. It's really more about, making, substantive discussion and decisions on board matters, save the back and forth debate for the public meeting. If anybody has, worked in the corporate world, they love to say, God, this meeting could have been an email. In FOI world, it's sort of the opposite of, maybe this email, could have been a meeting. So again, just something to be careful about there. Okay, so the way that I find it's helpful to talk about the requirements in terms of notices, agendas, and minutes for meetings is if we look at the two main types of meetings. There is a third type of meeting called emergency meetings, which I'll touch on very briefly. But most of your meetings are going to be either a regular meeting or it's going to be a special meeting. So we'll start with regular meetings. So you probably have already done this, or maybe you're doing it soon. Every year you should submit an annual schedule of meetings to the town clerk, and those are all your regular meetings. So you decide we're going to meet the second and fourth Tuesday of every month at the library, and you put that at 7 o'clock. You put that all together. You file it with the town clerk. Those are your regular meetings, and those are really kind of locked in. Those are your regular meetings for the year. But if something comes up, and maybe that date doesn't work, or you need to add additional meetings, or, there's a snowstorm and the meeting gets moved, anytime you're going to hold a meeting outside of those meetings on your regular schedule, then that becomes what is called a special meeting under the law. So really the only thing that makes it special is the date. You can do anything that you could do in terms of, conducting business from a regular meeting to a special meeting. So it's not like a special meeting, you can only address certain issues or one topic or anything like that. You can conduct business, that you would have conducted at a regular meeting at a special meeting. So next, let's talk about notices and agendas. So for regular meetings, notice and agenda, the notice is really on the schedule, so that's taken care of. The agenda needs to be filed at least 24 hours in advance with the town clerk. Interestingly enough, the web posting requirements for the FOI law for municipalities are not as strict, I think, as most people think they are. So for a regular meeting, the agenda actually doesn't have to be posted on the website. Now, I would strongly encourage you to do that because I think, more and more people are looking on the website for this information. Again, this was a law written back in 1975 when people were coming into town hall, they were looking at the board. There still are people who do that, but more people are probably checking the website. So again, a regular meeting has to be filed in the town clerk's office at least 24 hours before the meeting. You should try to get it on the website too, but if something happens and it doesn't get posted to the web until the morning of the meeting, that wouldn't be something that would be a violation. The other thing I think is important, to consider is that you can't file an agenda if the town hall is closed. I have had people, who have said, well, I emailed it to the town clerk, on a Saturday or on a holiday or whatever it may be. But if you just email it in, or you slip it under the door or something like that, it is not publicly available, and that's what the agendas are required to be. So it either needs to be publicly available, it has to be publicly available in the clerk's office, and it could also be publicly available on the website. So what that means, for example, is if your board, meets on Tuesdays, you got to be mindful of all those Monday holidays that we have, because if your normal course of business is, I go every Monday morning to town hall and I give them the agenda, if a couple weeks from now we have Martin Luther King Day, so if your board is meeting on Tuesday, that agenda needs to be in by the end of business Friday. So again, it needs to be filed when the office is open. So you could file it at the end of the day Friday. That's more than 24 hours ahead of time. It's not like you have to file it, calculate when the meeting is and go back and all that. But if you could not file it on the Monday holiday, Martin Luther King Day, when town hall is closed. And for a special meeting, similar, a little bit different in that because there was no notice of when the meeting was taking place, the agenda is really the first time people are going to learn, the meeting is happening. So those need to be filed, the notice and the agenda. It's usually the same document at least 24 hours in advance. And those do have to be posted on the website. So if you have a special meeting, make sure, you check, the day before and you see that it gets posted. If for some reason it's not on the website, you want to follow up on that because, if it wasn't posted on the website for a special meeting, that would be a potential violation. The next sort of difference here, At a regular meeting, you can add items to the agenda by a 2/3 vote. A lot of times we have an item on the agenda. It says new business. We go around. Does anyone have any new business? Yes, I do have something new business I want to add. You need a 2/3 vote to add the item to the agenda, and then you can discuss it. You could take action on it. Regular meeting, that's permissible. A special meeting, you cannot add additional items to the agenda, as new business. Doesn't matter how many votes you have. If it's a special meeting, you can't do it. So my advice would be, if you're preparing agendas for special meetings, I would say just take off new business, because, if you leave it on there, somebody who doesn't know maybe could say, oh yeah, let's add something. And, if you're the person who knows and you're not there, or whatever happens, it could just be an invitation for somebody to add something to the agenda at a special meeting, which you cannot do. So if something comes up, in the course of a special meeting, and people feel like there needs to be a discussion on it, you would have to wait, for the next time that you have a meeting. And this is a small distinction, and we'll talk more in detail about minutes in a second. But I don't know why the legislature made this distinction here. But regular meetings, you have to file your minutes within 7 calendar days. And special meetings, you have to file your minutes within 7 business days. So if you have a special meeting, you got a little bit more time, to get your minutes together. Anyone have any questions on that? Regular meeting versus special meetings? Yes.
You said something about new business and 2/3 vote to add an item to the agenda. A lot of our town agendas say new business as an agenda item. So are you saying that whatever that discussion is going to be, if somebody has new business, there needs to be a vote?
Yeah, if you're going to add something under new business, then you should take a vote to do that, because if all it says is new business, then the item isn't on the agenda, and obviously you're not going to know until you get to the meeting. So if you go under new business and somebody says hey, I want to talk about the sidewalks in front of the police station, you would say, okay, let's just add it to the agenda, to have that discussion. Any other questions? Yes.
On a special meeting, when you have your agenda, can you put down like generalities, like old business, and then use that as an introduction to adding things to the agenda?
So I would say if you're going to have old business on a special meeting agenda, I think you'd have to list what the old business items are. You could have old business that carried over on a special meeting agenda, but I think you'd probably need to be more specific as to what the old business is under that item. Any other questions? So there is a third type of meeting, as I mentioned, emergency meetings, and as the name suggests, really, these are meetings that you hold in the event of an emergency. And really, what it comes down to is our Supreme Court looked at this, about 15 years ago, and what they said was that the only time where you should have an emergency meeting is where it's a situation that is unexpected and demands immediate action that makes it impossible to give 24 hours notice for a meeting. If you remember what we were just talking about, you can call a special meeting on 24 hours notice. And, as we'll talk about more in a second, there's also, the ability now to host electronic meetings. So if you really need to get together, soon, there are ways you can do it, with a special meeting. You could even meet remotely if you wanted to. But if something comes up and it's so critical that it can't wait, then you would have an emergency meeting. And, the reason emergency meetings are so limited is because there's no requirement to publish a notice or an agenda. So essentially it is a secret meeting. There's no notice to the public, that it's happening. Somebody once asked me, well, are they open to the public? And I think the answer to that is yes. There's nothing that says this is not open to the public, but if they don't know when it's happening or where it's going on, chances are they're probably not going to stumble in. But if somebody did walk in, it would still be a public meeting. You can only consider emergency matters, so you can't go back to old business from other meetings. You can only consider that emergency matter. And then with emergency meetings, the minutes need to be filed within 72 hours of the meeting. They have to be posted online, and you have to state the reason for the emergency. I'll give you some examples of what we've seen, where maybe an emergency meeting might make sense. During COVID, we saw this. Obviously the governor, the executive orders were changing from the day to the day. Boards of education were having to make decisions about what to do with schools. Town halls were closed. There was a lot of things going on there where if you waited to the next day, the world could look a whole lot different. Another example, I got a call from a small town, and ultimately they didn't end up needing the emergency meeting because they had a Board of Selectmen meeting that night and they just added it to the agenda. But they had gotten, a report back from DEEP that there was a dam in their community that was at imminent risk of failing, so much so that the state told them basically, you got to go out there right now, hire somebody, you got to do something. They gave them a letter that just said, this is at imminent risk of failing if you don't do something. So they had to appropriate some money to hire somebody to go out there and start shoring it up. They happened to be able to do it at that night's Board of Selectmen meeting because they were having a meeting. But if they didn't have a meeting that night, I would argue, that might be an emergency, right? If the state is telling you there's a risk to something happening, I think that's what we want to be thinking with emergency meetings is, there's a public health risk, there's a safety risk, there's a security risk, there's something where we need to take immediate action. If we don't, there's going to be some sort of consequence there. Any questions on emergency meetings? All right. And then last but not least, I sort of alluded to this a little bit. When is a meeting not a meeting? So there are, if you look in the definition of the FOI, what makes a meeting, it, was what was there earlier, but then it says meeting does not include, and then it lists these other things here. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is caucuses. So under the FOI Act, there's kind of two types of caucuses. The first is, members of the same board and same political party, they're automatically a caucus. If you have a situation where, the majority of a board is made up of members of different political parties, or you might have unaffiliated members who caucus with one side or the other, if that's the case, if you have a caucus that is not just strictly people in the same political party, you're supposed to file and register with the town clerk. So, if somebody was a, libertarian candidate and they won election to a seat and they were going to caucus with the Republicans, then they should file something with the town clerk and saying, for my term on the town council, I'm going to caucus with the Republicans. So another thing with caucuses too, again, same board. So you cannot have caucuses, between the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance, or between the Board of Finance and the Board of Education. Even if everybody is the same political party, it's, members of the same board. So with caucuses, one of the things that I think is a little bit of a frustration sometimes is that, caucus is only defined in the FOI Act as, who the people are. There's no legal, limit that says this is what you can discuss in a caucus. But I would say, I think it's sort of against the spirit of the Freedom of Information Act to try to use a caucus, as a vehicle to say, look, we're going to have all our real discussions and all our deliberations and everything in the caucus. And that can happen a lot of times because, you have a lot of boards, where, one party controls the board. You might have a 9-member board and there's 6 Republicans. And then those 6 Republicans, they can meet in a caucus, but they could also decide what they're going to do in that caucus and not tell the public, and they could come to the meeting and they could do what we said earlier that we were trying to avoid. My understanding with the caucus provision is really it was put in there for the General Assembly when they were, passing the FOI law. Somebody looked at this and said, well, wait, what about our caucuses? And if you spend any time at the Capitol, that they caucus a lot. I used to be a political reporter, and sometimes they would say, oh, the session starts at 10 o'clock, and it'd be 11:30, and they're still in the caucus room, and they haven't even gotten out to talk about the first bill yet. So when it trickles down to the local boards, sometimes I feel like you want to avoid that temptation to say, well, we could just have a caucus. We could talk about it in a caucus. Again, there's nothing, that is a violation of what you talk about in a caucus. You can discuss anything, but I would argue really, when we think of caucus, we should be thinking about, political strategy, getting everyone on the same page. If the Republicans on the Planning and Zoning Commission want to talk about an application, I would argue that should be done at the public meeting. It's not inherently a political issue or a strategy issue, or something like that. But again, as long as the people are correct, you can have a caucus. You're not required to notice the caucuses because it's not a meeting. And again, you have to keep it to the people that we discussed. So some of these other ones, a personnel search committee for an executive level employee. So the law allows a board or commission to appoint a search committee, and that can include members of the board. Sometimes a board of education, if they're doing a superintendent search committee, I've seen instances where they could appoint the whole board to be a search committee. You're allowed to do that. So that search committee is exempt from all the meeting requirements. So they don't have to post agendas, they don't take minutes, they don't have to do any of that. The meetings are not open to the public. But the only thing the search committee can do is come up with a recommendation of a candidate, and then the candidate has to go before the board through the normal public process. So what that means is your search committee could do things like, review resumes. You could, do initial interviews with people, to try to narrow it down to maybe a finalist or a group of finalists. And then those people are going to go through the ordinary, public process, but you don't have to have a public meeting every single time, you want to go through the stack of resumes with other people on the board. The second is strategy or negotiations related to collective bargaining. So really, strategy sessions with collective bargaining, it means that you could have a quorum or more of a board there. So if there was an example where, the whole board of selectmen wanted to meet with the leaders of the town employee union to talk about a contract, they could do that. It could be the whole board and not just the first selectman. Staff meetings of public agencies are not public meetings. So if it's a meeting strictly of town staff, it's not open to the public. And then there's this piece in the FOI law about chance or social meetings. And what it, essentially what it says is if a quorum or more of board members are at a gathering, but the gathering is not for the intention of discussing board business. So they're at a town event, they're at the high school football game, they're at a, event at the library. When they're in those situations, they're allowed to be there and it doesn't make it an illegal meeting. However, everything we talked about the discussions, still applies. So, if you're on the library board, for example, you might go to a lot of events at the library. There's probably a lot of, bigger library events, and there might be a quorum of library board members there. And that's okay. They can go, they can support the programs, but they can't be, sitting in the back of the audience and talking about, what's coming up at the next meeting or, other business before the board. The other thing I always, sort of say you should strive to avoid is what I call the parking lot meeting, which happens all the time. We have our meeting and then we go out into the parking lot and we're all standing around and we're kind of debriefing. A lot of times it's probably just catching up on things and talking about the new restaurant that opened and where you're going on vacation. A lot of times those discussions are probably not about board business, but you want to avoid continuing the discussion you had at the meeting out there in the parking lot. Let's imagine that you had a controversial site plan at the Planning and Zoning Commission, right? It's something that happens from time to time. And then you have to continue the public hearing, right? We had so many people come out, we got to continue it to the next meeting. If the developer's leaving the meeting and he sees all the Planning and Zoning Commissioners standing out in the parking lot and they're talking, that developer may think, well, they're probably talking about my project. Or if the developer heard them talking about his or her project, they could file a complaint. They may not even know everything that you said, but they could say, look, they were there. I heard them say something about me. For all I know, they were talking about what they're going to do at the next meeting regarding that proposal. So these are the instances where, there's exceptions to the meetings requirements. I think the biggest one is probably caucuses. Anyone have any questions on any of that? Yes.
I don't know if this will make sense. The caucus rule. So within a party, within a board, you technically can discuss within your party members, if it's strategy or policy.
Yep.
But what I heard you say was you can't cross the caucus from one board, members of the same party in one board, and members of the same party in another board.
Yes. So like you could. So you could not have a caucus between, Democrats on the Board of Finance and Democrats on the Board of Ed.
But does that apply only if you're at a quorum? Or like if you had...
Yeah, so if you had, they would have to be a majority of the board. So if the minority on one board wanted to meet with the minority of another board, it's not really a caucus, but it would be, minorities of two boards meeting. Yes, yeah. That. There's no quorums involved. Yeah, this is everything here again. Yeah, the important point to note is that, it's saying even though you have a quorum, you can do it. So, where this would come up is like the controlling party of a board. So if the Democrats control the Board of Finance and they also control the Board of Ed, they can't invite all the Democrats on the Board of Ed and all the Democrats on the Board of Finance, to have a meeting. But again, based on what we talked about, the chair of each board, those two could meet, or two members of each board, could meet together. It's just that when you get to the quorum is where, you run into the issue. Any other questions? Okay. So minutes. What I think with minutes is where I see people run into trouble sometimes is I think there's this idea that, minutes need to really be, a perfect encapsulation of everything that happened at the meeting. And I think you'd be surprised to learn the legal requirements for minutes are really pretty sparse. Really, legally, the only thing you have to have in the minutes, it's a record of the votes, who voted for what or for whom. And you also want to make sure that in the minutes you identify or you take them in a way where people can identify how each member voted. Doesn't mean you have to list every single person every time. If it's unanimous, you could just say it passed unanimously. If it passed, with one no vote, you could say, it passed 6-1 and, Commissioner Smith, voted no. But you want to make sure it's clear how each member voted. It's not just putting a numerical count. So we have to have the record of the votes. We have to have attendance of the board members, what board members were present and at that meeting. And then if you have an executive session, you have to list who attended the executive session besides the board members, unless that person was there as a job applicant. There's a provision that allows you not to put their name in the minutes because, they may not want their employer to know that they're looking for a new job. So those are the only legal requirements. So everything else you put in there is really at your discretion. Now, obviously, you're going to have more than just that. You're going to want to include some of the discussion and some of the flavor and some of the, the debate about what happened. But I'll give you some examples of, things that I think are important. If you have public comment, for example, you do not have to list every single thing that the person said in public comment. You could summarize, you could list the topic that they spoke about. Steve Smith, 15 Jones Lane, talked about, he was upset that we're, spending too much money on the fire department, or whatever it may be. You could also just choose not to include public comment. You don't have to. Nobody has a right to be in the minutes. If they speak at the meeting, they've spoken at the meeting, but, you're not required to list every single person, that spoke. It's really a policy, that's up to you. And what I find is, most people are pretty good at it, but you want to try to find that middle ground because the next piece is really most important, and that is minutes have to be filed within 7 days of the meeting. So 7 business days, special meeting, 7 calendar days, regular meeting. You see there it says draft minutes are okay. Well, that's because in most cases, your board is not going to meet again within 7 days. So, people sometimes say, well, we haven't approved the minutes yet, right? What do we do? Well, you have to file whatever it is that you have available within the 7 days. So, get as much information as you can together, but you want to make sure you get them in within the 7 days. If you have 9-page single-spaced, minutes, but they come 3 weeks late, that would be a violation. Maybe the commission would say, wow, these are really detailed, but you're in violation because, they were not, filed in time. I know sometimes in smaller towns, I've heard from people who, it's hard. We don't have a recording secretary, somebody's sick. I know these things happen, but ultimately it's the board's responsibility to do the minutes. So if you don't have somebody who can assist you, then someone on the board has got to take the minutes. And again, they can be sparse. It's if you're between recording secretaries, maybe your minutes are not going to be as detailed as they used to be, but that's okay. You still need to make sure you do them and that you file them again with the town clerk within the 7 days. The other thing I think is important to just touch on is sort of sometimes people ask about the approval process for minutes. It's not really something that's laid out in the FOI law, so kind of how you do it is up to you. But what I think is sort of the best practice is, submit your minutes within 7 days, send them around to people, put them on the agenda for the next meeting. And then if there need to be changes made to the minutes, discuss it at the next meeting, take a vote, and approve the minutes with the changes, and then reflect those in that set of minutes for that meeting. So then if somebody looks to, you had your October meeting, if they go to the November minutes, it'll say the October minutes were adopted, and you could put the changes right in those minutes. I think that's easier than trying to constantly go back and refile, amended minutes or, approved minutes. In a lot of cases, there's probably not a lot of changes that are made at all. They might just be kind of clerical things. I had a town clerk who called me yesterday because, all the boards and commissions in his town were making him, refile the minutes, even if there wasn't a change made, just so they could put approved on the top of them. And it just seemed like it was a lot of work and not needed. So that would be my guidance on that. Last but not least, so even if you have a virtual meeting and even if you record the meeting, you still do minutes. We always do minutes for every single meeting, whether it's in person, whether it's hybrid, whether it's fully virtual. Every meeting, we take minutes. Even if you have a meeting where the vast majority, or maybe the whole meeting, all the items are discussed in executive session, still a public meeting, you still do the minutes. Now, you're not going to have to take minutes of the executive session, but you're still going to have some minutes that say, we gavelled in, we went to executive session for this purpose, we came out, we took no votes, we adjourned. So every meeting has to have minutes. Does anyone have any questions about minutes? And again, minutes filed with the town clerk. As I said earlier about the posting requirements, there's actually, for the municipal level, there is not a time by which you have to post the minutes online. My advice would be, if you file them with the town clerk, then, try to post them online shortly after that. But as long as the minutes are available in town hall, then you're covered under the statute. But again, like with the agendas, I think it's important to get the information on the website, because I've had people who have called me and said, hey, there was a meeting 2 weeks ago, the minutes aren't on the website, how do I file a complaint? And the first thing I usually tell them is, did you call town hall and see that they might not have the minutes there? Maybe they just didn't post them yet, but they might be available for you at town hall before you go off and file the complaint. Why don't you check and see, make a call or stop in? So not required to post them online within the 7 days or within any period, but I think it's important to try to do that, as soon as you can. So records retention, it's actually not governed by the FOI law. There are other statutes dealing with records retention. What I would say for that, because it gets kind of complicated depending on the type of the record. If you go on the website, it's called the Office of Public Records Administrator. They have it's called a municipal retention schedule. And if you go into that, it explains, what the record is and then how long you're required to keep it. For, board and commission members, I think the number one thing is probably email correspondence. And for sort of general, kind of business emails, not, transitory type of things or copies of things, like, if you get a mass email from the town that there's a snow day or something like that. But for your emails, regarding your board business, the typical retention period is supposed to be 2 years for just sort of routine, board related correspondence. But if you have questions about other records, I would look on their website, because they do have like a searchable thing and you can look and see, because it really depends on the particular records. Like minutes, for example, you're supposed to keep forever. I think agendas, you can get rid of them after a year, but it varies depending on what the record is. So next I want to talk a little bit about electronic and remote meetings. And what I think is important is that people know it's a choice you have, how you have your meetings. You can have your meetings fully in person, you could have your meetings hybrid, or you could have your meetings fully remote. If you want to have meetings either hybrid or fully remote, then there are some additional requirements that go along with that, which I'll touch on here. So the first thing is, if you have a regular board meeting, and there's going to be some sort of, what the law refers to it as is a meeting with electronic access. So there's going to be a regular board meeting, and it's either going to be hybrid with a Zoom link, or it's going to be entirely on Zoom or Teams or whatever you use. The software doesn't matter. If you're going to have an electronic meeting, then there's this additional requirement. The agenda can still be filed 24 hours before the meeting, and that agenda should have the link on there. But there's a requirement 48 hours before the meeting that the instructions on how somebody can attend it electronically need to be posted on the website. So if you can file the agenda with the link 48 hours ahead of time, then you're all set. You've posted one document and you're clear. If for some reason you're still working on the agenda, then you would just want to post something, on your meeting calendar, your board and commission page, something that says, the February, senior center commission meeting is going to be held, virtually because we're worried about the snow. You don't have to say that, but maybe that's a reason why you might do it. So that 48-hour requirement kicks in. It's only for regular meetings, so you can have a special meeting on 24 hours notice electronically. That would be, that would be permissible. Sometimes people ask about recordings of public meetings. Do we have to record virtual meetings, and do we have to post them, and what do we do with all that? So the only meetings that you have to record under FOI are if you have a entirely online regular meeting. So one of your regular meetings is entirely virtual. Then you would have to record that meeting, and you would have to post the recording on your website, or you could post a link to the recording, a link to YouTube or something on the website within 7 days. And it has to remain available on the website for at least 45 days. So For those ones that you record, under that provision, 45 days go by, you could take them down if you wanted to. You could leave them up. It's up to you, what you do with that. If you record the meeting, you still do minutes. We always do minutes for every meeting. So recording does not, substitute for minutes. But if you record a meeting, maybe your minutes don't need to be as detailed because, there's a full recording available for people that they could go back and they could watch. And then the last thing I'll mention, I don't think we've seen this as much anymore, but early on during COVID, when everyone was kind of learning how to use Zoom, we saw a lot of what they called Zoom bombing, where these people would come in who had no connection to the meeting, and they were really just there to create havoc and cause chaos, and they would take over the screen and share things that were inappropriate, or they would put stuff in the chat. If any of that happens, you can mute that person, you can kick them out. You have the right to run an orderly meeting, in the same way that, if something like that happened at an in-person meeting, you're not going to stand there while this person is hurling obscenities, at people in the room. And it's, easier in the virtual world because we don't have to, drag the person out of the room. We can click the button and mute them, or we can click the button and kick them out of the meeting there. One other question I've gotten sort of recently about this, is that people have asked, well, does someone have to give their name? What if they log on to the meeting and it's just a phone number and we don't know who they are and we ask them and they won't say? I would go back to what we said earlier about all public meetings. People don't have to give their name to attend a public meeting. So that extends, virtually as well. So if somebody doesn't put their name on the Zoom, or he just has their phone number because they called in, you could ask them to identify themselves. But if they didn't, that wouldn't be a reason enough to kick them out unless they started acting inappropriately or misbehaving. Anyone have any questions on electronic or remote meetings? Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I usually always try to touch on that and it slipped my mind. But so board members always have the right to participate remotely regardless of the meeting format. So you can have a meeting noticed as in person, and if a board member is not feeling well, they could Zoom in, they could call in. If you think back to before we ever had Zoom meetings, you might have had a meeting where somebody would call in on the speakerphone. Somebody's on vacation, somebody slipped and fell, and they're in a cast at home or whatever, and they would call in on the speakerphone. So board members can always participate remotely regardless of the format. The one thing, if you have somebody on the phone, is just the law does say when they speak, they should identify themselves. So people who are following along can understand, who it is. When they're voting and when they're speaking, they should identify themselves. Okay. So this is really probably the hardest part of the meetings provisions of the law. Everything else we talked about, I think is pretty, sort of black and white in the statute. You got to do this by 7 days, you got 48 hours, you got 24 hours. The executive session is harder because it's the part of the meetings provisions that is the most open to interpretation. I get a lot of questions and a lot of queries about, can we do this in executive session, or does this fit in, or does that fit in? Where I find people get themselves in trouble is when they really try to sort of shoehorn something in that doesn't fit. So we'll talk about what the reasons are. And, if you find yourself in a situation where you're really struggling to make an argument that it fits into one of these, I would say chances are it probably doesn't. The FOI Act is all about, public access to information, and the exemptions are meant to be narrow, and that includes with executive session. The idea is that boards should be discussing their business in public, really, unless there's some sort of, really compelling reason why they shouldn't. And I think as we go through these reasons, really when you think about it, a lot of times it's for the benefit of the town. So they don't have to discuss, their legal strategy in public, so they don't have to reveal sensitive security information. So we'll talk about that. So the first reason you can have an executive session is to discuss personnel matters. And what personnel matters means is you're discussing, the appointment, the performance, the health, the dismissal, an evaluation of either, a town employee, or it could also be about a member of the board or a prospective member of the board. You could interview potential candidates to fill a vacancy, for example, in an executive session. If you're going to discuss an employee in executive session, the law gives them the right to be notified. You have to notify them. You're the subject of an executive session. A lot of times you're going to tell them because you're going to want them to come, be there, right? If there's a disciplinary matter, you're going to want that employee to be there to hear from them. But regardless, you have to notify them of the executive session. And the reason is that the law allows that employee to object to that and to say, no, I don't want you talking about, this situation involving me in the executive session. I want you to talk about it in the open session. If that happens, the board or commission, their hands are tied, then they have to discuss that item in open session. A lot of different people have rights in the FOI Act, and that is one of the rights that is granted to public employees, is essentially that a board or commission can't talk about them in secret in an executive session, without them, saying basically it's okay, or at least not objecting to it. So that's personnel matters. The next, pending claims or litigation. This one is really pretty straightforward, but the key word in there is pending. So, this has got to be either, a lawsuit has been filed, you've received, a demand letter where somebody says, if you don't do this, I'm going to sue. It's not, meant to be hypothetical things, or this could get us sued, or we've got sued, or we've got a legal question. It's got to be pertaining to really a specific thing that is either has happened or it's imminent, to be filed, or it could be the board is considering taking legal action. So if the board is going to go to court, to enforce something, they could talk about that in executive session too. They don't have to tip off the person that they're going to, go get an injunction or something like that. The next reason to have an executive session is to discuss security matters. If you feel that the discussion would compromise that security issue. Unfortunately, we saw this a lot after Sandy Hook, when boards of education were reviewing their security plans and protocols. And I think there was even some grant money that went around from the state to make security upgrades. So in a situation like that, you could go into an executive session to just discuss the specifics and the parameters of the security system. It's important to note you can't vote on anything in executive session. So with all these things here, you have to come out and take a public vote. It doesn't mean that your public vote is going to have to, recriminate and relitigate everything that you talked about in the executive session. But in the security matter, you would have to say, like, let's say Simsbury High School, they want to talk about its security system there. They can go into executive session, but if the Board of Ed needs to, approve, $200,000 for the security system, they would have to take that vote in public. They're not going to tell the public what the system entails, but they're still going to have to take a public vote, to hire the company to do the work. You can discuss the sale or lease of property in executive session if there's concern that, publicity would impact the price point. An example there, could be if the town is considering, maybe there's, some acreage that's on the market, and the town is saying, well, maybe this would be good for open space, and it's right near this trail and in this other area. They could have an executive session discussion to, talk about, what they want to put an offer in at, those sorts of things. There would still have to be a public vote that would be taken. But what it allows the board to do is, the public doesn't know that they're interested in acquiring that parcel until they make the vote and they make the offer, so that there's not a chance that somebody else in the community could jump in and could bid the price up, and then the town ends up having to pay more. They lose out on acquiring that piece of property because they had to indicate in public that was about to happen. And then the last one is really kind of the broadest one, and that is you can discuss any records that are exempt from FOI in an executive session, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because if you don't have to disclose it under FOI, why would you have to, discuss it publicly? Where that comes up most frequently, really two examples, I think. The first is there's an exemption in the FOI law, and we'll go through some of these as we go on, about attorney-client privilege. So if you get a communication from your attorney, about a legal issue, that's protected. You don't have to disclose those records. So if you want to go into executive session, you could bring the town attorney into the executive session, and you could bring the memo, and you could go over, what the issue is. You could ask questions, clarifications, get advice on the legal issue. That's really the best way to handle it if you have a legal issue that you want to have discussed before the board and there's not a pending lawsuit. Really the best way to handle it is to, ask your town attorney, hey, we need help with this issue. Can you come up with, give us some guidance, and then we're going to go into executive session to talk about your guidance. So you're going in really to talk about a record, which is this memo that's protected. I've seen sometimes people where they'll just put something like executive session legal or executive session, town attorney. You can't just have an executive session, for sort of free ranging legal advice. It's got to be tied to a specific issue. So if you want to go into executive session, you need to have a 2/3 vote to go into executive session. So you want to make sure that you get the vote and you record that in the minutes. Agendas for special meetings, agendas for executive sessions. The commission has had numerous cases where we have said that, and the courts have affirmed this, the standard for what you have to provide on an agenda for an executive session, I mentioned it earlier, it needs to fairly apprise the public of what is to be discussed in that executive session. So the public does not get to be in your executive session. They're not going to hear all the discussions. They're not going to know, who said what, and that sort of thing. But the topic is really fair game. So what that means is you want to, and I see this all the time, you want to avoid an agenda item like executive session personnel, executive session security, executive session pending claims or litigation. Better agenda items would be things like executive session discussion of security improvements at Simsbury High School. If it's a personnel matter, executive session to discuss the performance of a police officer. That doesn't tell us what the issue is. Is the police officer doing good? Is the police officer doing bad? Is it a disciplinary thing? We don't know the details, but we know, okay, whatever it is, the Board of Police Commissioners is talking, or the Board of Selectmen, they're talking about, something involving a personnel matter involving a police officer. I would argue with pending claims or litigation, it's public, record what lawsuits are filed. So, if somebody's in litigation with the town, that's all available, in the court system. So I would say for something like that, you could put the docket, discussion of, Smith versus Simsbury, or you could put what the nature of the litigation is, discussion of the dog park lawsuit, so it allows people to understand, the lawsuit that's being discussed. Again, they don't know if you're talking about a settlement. They don't know if you're talking about going to trial. They don't know what you're discussing. They just know that, okay, they're talking about a specific lawsuit. And to give you a real kind of example of why that's important, we have a complaint, currently pending in another community where, there are some people who are involved in litigation with the town, and, they put an agenda item on there, that was very vague. And the people that had this lawsuit were, they saying, well, we may want to know if they're talking about our case, because what if they come out and they vote to settle it, or they vote to do something, right? We may want to be there, even though we can't be there for the executive session. We may want to be there to see if they're going to vote to resolve this matter. But if we don't know if they're talking about it, then we can't make a decision about whether or not to attend the meeting. And really, agendas, what it comes down to is it's about providing enough information so somebody can make an informed decision about whether or not to attend the meeting. Is the thing I care about going to be discussed at this meeting, or not? And if it is, they go to the meeting and, they either hear it or they don't hear it. It doesn't mean you have to talk about everything on the agenda, or anything like that. But if it's not on the agenda, and even with an executive session, if it's not sufficiently detailed, then that could be a violation. And then the last thing with executive session, people often ask who can go into the executive session. So you can invite in anyone that you need to assist you, whether that's town staff, the town attorney, whoever it may be. But the people that you're bringing in, they should be there for a particular purpose. They should be providing you with, testimony, opinion, expertise. One of our, we had a case on an executive session once, and I liked what one of our hearing officers said. She said, executive session is not a spectator sport. So the people who are there should really be participating. And if you bring in the attorney and you ask them some questions and you don't need the attorney any longer, then even, the attorney should be asked to leave. Okay, thank you. We've gotten all the information we need. When it's time for the board members to deliberate, it's really meant to be for the board members to deliberate. So does anyone have any questions on executive session? Okay. All right. So now we'll move on to the records portion of the law. And for starters, kind of like we did with meetings, I'm just going to touch on what the definition of a public record is. And, I'm not going to read it because it's up there on the screen already. But what I want you to take away from that is to understand just how broad the definition is in the law. So you see there, it's any recorded data or information that relates to the conduct of the public's business. That is what makes something a public record. Does it relate to the conduct of the public's business? Anything that you receive, anything that you create, anything that, comes into your files, in the course of your public business, those are public records. The other thing I think is really important to note is you don't see anywhere on there discussion of the device that a record exists on. So what that means is, and I imagine this is probably the case for a lot of members of boards and commissions, you may be using your personal cell phone. You may be using your Yahoo account or your Gmail account. But if you send messages related to board business, those are public records, so they could be requested under FOI. We talked a little bit about records retention. They would be records that would need to be retained. So a public record is records dealing with the public's business. Does not matter if they exist on a personal device or a town device. It doesn't mean that under FOI somebody gets to go looking through your phone. I've had people who sometimes get worried about that and say, oh my God, they're going to go through my text messages. It doesn't mean that, but it means, somebody could say, I want to make an FOI request for text messages between the chairman of the Planning and Zoning Commission and the town planner about a particular application. And if they were texting, substantive discussions about the application, then those would have to be provided. If they're discussing other things, maybe they're friends or their kids go to the same school and they're talking about those sorts of things, those are not public records. It's not, it doesn't mean that just because, text messages are public, all your text messages are public. It would only be text messages pertaining to public business. And just so you understand, usually what the protocol is, at least in my experience, a lot of times when these requests come in, it's almost always, it's going to be incumbent upon you to do the search. You are going to go through your own device. You're going to take out the responsive records. You're going to provide them to either directly to the requester or to the town, and the town's going to give them to the requester. And if there's an FOI complaint, because sometimes people say, well, what happens if someone comes to the commission? Is the commission going to take my phone? And the answer to that is no. We, to my knowledge, we've never done that. The only time that we ever even got a little bit close was there was a case many years ago involving the current mayor of Bridgeport when he was the former mayor of Bridgeport before all of his troubles and his incarceration and all that. There was a case where they were getting close to thinking about potentially taking a phone in, but it ultimately didn't happen. So if it didn't happen there, I'm pretty sure it's probably not going to happen on a local board or commission. But what could happen is, you may have to come to a hearing and say, look, I went through my phone. These are the messages. This is how I know I had, I provided everything I had. I looked in my Gmail. I looked in my Yahoo. I gave them everything I had. So I just want to make people at ease with that. Your personal devices and emails, if they pertain to public business, it's public records, but it does not mean that your whole, world of public or private devices is open to the public. So the other part of the definition of a public record, any data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, so everything is a public record, and all public records can be either people can request to inspect them or request copies, except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute. And that one sentence on the second bullet there does a lot of heavy lifting, because what it means is if there is another law that says something is confidential, should not be disclosed, maybe limits who can get access to it, if there's another law counter to FOI, that always supersedes. So if it's federal, if it's state, if there's something else in the statutes that says it's confidential or it's not available, then that's what you have to follow. The challenge with that is those are not all in one place. There are exemptions right in the FOI Act that we'll talk about in a second. Some of these we already mentioned, attorney-client privilege, for example. But then there's all kinds of other statutes that deal with public records and have references to things being exempt or things being confidential. So it's really just important that, the little bit of homework I'll leave you with is, you want to try to learn a little bit about other statutes that may govern the work that you do. Most of them are records. There's a few odd things about meetings. Like one thing sometimes people ask me about is there's a requirement about audio recordings of certain land use boards. That's not in FOI. It's in the land use statutes, because if you go to court, the judge wants a copy of, what was discussed at the commission so they can decide, if it was handled appropriately. So sometimes there are other statutes that deal with meetings. There's a lot of them that deal with records, and there's not one exhaustive list anywhere. So that can be sort of challenging. What I would say is if you run into a situation where you're saying, gee, it seems like this is something that, there would be a protection for, you might want to do a little bit of research and see. I got a call today from somebody who, was wondering, that the Department of Public Health, they wanted some, investigations, from a health department. And I had to explain to them, there's some statutes about, access to health department investigations, for example, not in the FOI law, but in health statutes that govern, what information can be released. So just kind of an overview of some of the different aspects of the FOI law. That last point, I mentioned it earlier, but I think it, bears repeating. You don't have to answer questions, do research, or create records that don't already exist. FOI is providing, copies of records that you keep or that you maintain. The question thing, that comes up sometimes. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to help people and answer their questions, but what it means is if somebody's not happy with the answers, or you can't answer the question, that's not something they can file a complaint about. If you don't know the answer to the question, you don't know the answer to the question. But if you have the records, you have to provide the person with the records. When someone makes an FOI request, there's no requirement they use a specific form or cite the statute or anything like that. If you get an email and somebody's requesting a record, that is an FOI request. It's as simple as that. So, if you had a meeting and then the next morning you got an email from somebody who said, hey, can I please get a copy of the presentation, from your meeting last night? That's the FOI request. It doesn't need to be any more, complicated than that. So very briefly on records inspections, probably not something you will have to deal with all that much. It's more for the town staff side of things. But important to know, the FOI law, we often think about people making, written requests for copies of public records. That's important to know. If somebody wants copies of records, they do have to put it in writing. So if somebody calls you or stops you, at the grocery store and says, hey, can you get me this thing? You could tell them, please send me an email. But people can inspect public records. They can come into a town building during regular office hours. They can request to inspect public records. It doesn't mean that happens immediately. There's a standard in the law called promptness that we'll talk about on the next slide that deals with kind of responses to all FOI requests. But just important to know, you can go into a town hall and you can ask to look at records. In terms of fees for the FOI Act, the fees are really kind of nominal. There's not charges for copies of electronic records, except in sort of very unique circumstances. So if somebody's asking for emails or text messages or something like that, there's not going to be and they ask for them to be delivered electronically, there's not going to be a per page fee. If you send them 10 pages of emails, you're not going to charge them 50 cents a page for each email. For paper copies, however, you could charge 50 cents a page for paper copies. You can charge for a digital storage device like a USB stick or a DVD. And if the cost of the FOI request is going to exceed $10, then you're allowed to collect the fees for that up front. Anyone have any questions on any of that? Okay. So how long do I have to fulfill an FOI request? Very common question. So if you get an FOI request, you need to make sure that you acknowledge the records request within 4 business days. And the reason that's important is that the way the law is written, it says that if somebody does not receive a response within 4 business days, they can consider that request denied. Even if you don't intend to deny it, even if you've been working on it, if you don't respond to them, they have no way of knowing that you've received it, essentially. Again, it's kind of a little bit of a vestige of the 1975 aspect when people were mailing their FOI requests. It was like, you got to send a letter back so they know that the letter made it there. Today with email, it's a lot easier just to respond to the email. So, it's something where, if you get an FOI request, and important to note, people can make an FOI request to anybody who has the records. So, if you're on a board or commission, you may be thinking, well, shouldn't the FOI request go to the town planner or go to whoever it is? But if you get the request and you have the records, then you need to make sure that there's a response. Now, it could be from someone else. It might be that the staff reply on behalf of you, or the town attorney replies, or whoever it might be, but you want to make sure somebody replies within 4 business days. So if you get an FOI request, you want to just make sure, you get it to the proper people who are going to handle it, whether it's you, whether it's somebody else in town. And I think this is a good part to mention that, the way the FOI Act works really is we set out the requirements. We don't dictate a specific process. So, every town does it a little bit differently. So you might have internal processes as to how you do that. Some boards I've seen where they say, look, if we get an FOI request, we're going to have the chairperson respond. That's okay. But you just want to make sure all that happens and that response gets out, that initial response within 4 business days. And then overall, sort of globally, the law says that people have the right to, if they request public records, that they be provided promptly. Now, what does that mean? The way the commission looks at this, we have this advisory opinion that was issued, I think more than 40 years ago. And what it says is that records requested under FOI need to be provided without undue delay. There was a court case recently where this was looked at, and what the judge in that case said was that, FOI is a primary duty of public agencies. But the judge also recognized that, public agencies, have other work and other obligations. So it's really kind of this balance. And the way the commission looks at it is we have all these different factors. So if there's a complaint dealing with the issue of promptness, we would look at things like the volume of records requested, how many records are requested, how large are the requests, the amount of personnel time necessary to comply with the request, how many hours is this going to take. If you're on a board or commission and you ever get a request for, your correspondence, that might be something that, there's not a lot of hours in the day to get that done. You have a day job, you've got family obligations, you've got the work of your board and commission. So it may be that you only have, maybe an hour or two a week where you can try to work on an FOI request that comes in. And based on all these different factors, that might be appropriate depending on some of these other things. So there's also a couple things in here. If the requester includes some of this information, if they don't include it, you don't have to ask them. But if they tell you either, a time by which they need the records, or the importance to them of obtaining the records within the information within the records. Sometimes this comes up in the context. I was doing a training yesterday over in Avon at the police department. A lot of times when people go to a police department, they'll say, hey, I want my police report. I have a court date, in February. I need it for my court date. I want to understand, what happened. So if somebody asks and has a deadline or something like that, and you reasonably think you can do it, I would say try to do that. But it doesn't mean that somebody can just tell you, I need this in 10 days, and you're required to do that. It's just another thing that we weigh. And then also, really for the benefit of you all, we also look at the importance to the public of completing other agency business without losing time to complying with the FOI request, and also time constraints you're under to complete other work. So what that means is, there may be times of the year where things are really busy. In a school district, that tends to be around graduation and the end of the school year. For some of the town boards and commissions, probably around the budget, when the budget is being developed, that's a very busy time. So what that means is if somebody makes a request in that time period, you might have other things that really are kind of front burner that you have to get done. You've got a deadline for this, you've got a statute that says you have to file this by this. You need to get the budget in time for there to be a referendum vote or whatever it is. So there can be a lot of factors that go into that. Really what the commission ultimately, tries to strike is really kind of a reasonable balance. People under FOI have the right to request public information. You should not be creating, artificial barriers or undue delays. Sort of a good example of that recently was, we had a case where, smaller town, and somebody made an FOI request. They pulled all the records together. They had them all available, and they told the person, well, we can't give you the records until we our next Board of Selectmen meeting, because we have to discuss it at the Board of Selectmen meeting. There was no reason in that case why there had to be a discussion at the Board of Selectmen meeting, about giving out the records. They were public records. They were all ready to go. And this person had to wait a month for the next meeting, I guess, just so they could say at the meeting, hey, we're going to do this. Is everyone okay with it? That would be an example of where you're kind of creating something that is not, an artificial sort of delay there in the process. These cases on promptness are hard because it's really fact-based determination. So, people sometimes call me and they'll say, this is what the request is. And, what do you think? It can be hard, to make a judgment, on that in any one case. So it really depends on the circumstances. So the last thing I want to cover is just very briefly, I'll discuss a little bit about the exemptions and exceptions to the Freedom of Information Act. So the exemptions are the things that are in the FOI Act. So if you ever look, I guess if you can't sleep one night and you want to read the FOI Act, you'll see in there's a list of, I think it's grown to about 27 exemptions that are right in the FOI law. And those are permissive, which means it says you do not have to disclose. It's not saying you can't, but it's saying you don't have to give out these certain different things. And we'll talk about those in a second. Preliminary drafts, certain personnel records, it would be an invasion of personal privacy, trade secrets, there's a whole list of those. The exceptions are, as we talked about other state statutes. The challenge with, the exceptions is that some of those are what we call a shall not. Some of the exceptions are you can't give this out. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't do it. So it's important, again, as I said, if you work in a particular area, you're dealing with sensitive information, you want to check and see. We had a commission meeting today, and we had a case involving, one of those exceptions, which is that there's a law in the DCF statutes that says, information relative to child abuse, wherever located, is exempt from disclosure under FOI. So even though it's in DCF, it doesn't just apply to DCF records. The courts have said because it says wherever that is located, that can mean if you ask for information from a school and it's about child abuse, if you ask for information from a police department and it's about child abuse, you can't give that out. So there's those types of laws. There's an erasure statute for the police department. If somebody gets their case dismissed, it can't be disclosed. There's all kinds of different exceptions. One I put on there just because I think it's kind of interesting. I don't do it to pick on teachers. My wife is actually a teacher, so I can vouch for that. But There's a law that says that the evaluations of public school teachers and other educators in schools cannot be released under FOI. Only applies to educators, does not apply to other town employees. You can get the evaluation of a police officer, you cannot get the evaluation of a teacher. And it's just because there's a thing in the education statutes, based on some concerns that were raised, years ago in the legislature. So sometimes, even the exceptions don't always, make sense. So last but not least, state employee evaluations would be public. It's only for teachers, and I was sort of kind of wondering why that was, and I actually looked into the legislative history of it, and what they said was there was a concern that if parents were able to get the evaluations of the teachers at the school, they would all go to the principal and they would say, I want my kid in the class of the teacher who got the highest score. That was the argument at the time, and the legislature said, well, we think based on that, it kind of makes sense. Hasn't been revisited, since then to my knowledge, but, it's just kind of interesting because I could see a lot of arguments about well, why them and not other people? There's maybe you say all evaluations should not be public. Obviously the commission would not support that, but, sometimes you have these things where, there's an issue that arises and somebody passes a law over here dealing with one specific thing. And then, all of a sudden, it becomes part of what we have to all deal with. So this is the last slide I'll end on, because I know we're coming up on time and I just want to leave a little bit at the end for some questions. So this is not a comprehensive list, but it gives you an idea of the types of things that are exempt right in the FOI Act. This is in Connecticut General Statute 1210. Preliminary drafts and notes, certain personnel or medical files. This is related to public employees. So if somebody's requesting the personnel file of an employee, it would have to be disclosed unless, disclosure would be an invasion of privacy, which is usually going to be more about medical information or things, reflecting, things happening outside of work. Law enforcement has a lot of exemptions for information. There's protections for witnesses, victims, things regarding ongoing investigations. Records relating to pending claims or litigation, so that kind of goes in tandem with a lot of these. You'll see they kind of go in tandem with the executive session, so you don't have to reveal, discussions of a settlement or something like that. Trade.
So a city, town, state, anybody's personnel file is FOI, because to me that would be an invasion right there off the bat.
So, when this came up, I'll just go to the slide on just to mention it. So the way it works is there's this court case, the Supreme Court, in 1993, and they came up with this standard. And what they said is for personnel files of town employees, the information has to be disclosed unless it would be highly offensive and not a matter of public concern. And that case, the Perkins case, what it was somebody had requested, there was I think it was a school social worker who took an extended leave of absence from a school district, and somebody made a request they wanted the information about, when they went out on leave, how many days they took, were they being paid, that sort of thing. And the school district objected to it. They said, look, this is a medical leave. So it went to the commission. The commission said, well, the attendance records should be public, not the medical information. But the school district objected, went all the way to our Supreme Court, and then they came up with the standard. What I find, when I do this for town staff is I think people who work in the private sector are kind of shocked by this, that, that you can just get a personnel file of a public employee, but that, that they're public records. And when I do this, especially when I speak to state employees about this, one of the things I try to emphasize is, one, we work for the state, our salaries are paid for by the taxpayers, all of our equipment, our computers and everything, it's all state money. And also, there's a lot of people who, will, it's kind of a trade-off. There are a lot of benefits to working in the public sector. There are people out there who are very critical of public employees and the pensions and the salaries, and can you believe it, all that. But then on the other hand, you don't have this level of privacy that you have if you work in the private sector. So, yes, personnel files are available under FOI, really unless, there's a specific, privacy issue. And, that means things like disciplinary files, resumes of people who work for the town. Really the only things that I think would be exempt would be, really more dealing with specific medical records. If you go out on FMLA, a doctor's note, those are not going to be disclosed, those types of things. Or again, if it's, something related to, maybe you're going through a divorce or something like that, and there's some records in there reflecting that, or, you've got an alcohol problem and you're going to leave to seek treatment, take a leave from your job, those sorts of things. But if it pertains to the job that you do, whether you're doing a good job or a lousy job, those records are going to be public. Well, I think here's the the last point on that, because this is kind of what they said in the Perkins case, was that it's because it was about attendance. What they said was, well, it's important for the public to know when their employees are at work or not, but also what they're doing there, right? If somebody's making $200,000, might you not want to know what they're doing for that, right? That you could see their evaluation that talks about what their job is and what they do, and what they're I mean, your point of view is, a lot of people have that same thought. So I understand it, but I think that's kind of, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know what, this is something that, if you're curious, you can request your own personnel file. If you want to see what's in it. Yeah. If you want to see what's in it, you could always request your own personnel file, and you could see what's in it. So, yeah. Okay. So, just wrapping up here, some more of these things: trade secrets, test questions, scoring keys, and other examination material. That's pertaining to employment applications. Somebody. This is kind of interesting. There was a case recently where. This is an example of something that can't be disclosed under FOI. If somebody were to try to FOI the interview questions before a job interview, they don't have to be provided. But there was a case recently with the state police where some people got in trouble because they gave the interview questions to the person who applied before the interview. Didn't happen through FOI. They just kind of slipped it to the person. But, the reason there being, we don't want to compromise the job search. Collective bargaining strategy and negotiation, that kind of goes in tandem with the executive session. Attorney-client privilege, we talked about that. There's a pretty broad exemption for records that pose a security risk. I'm not going to get into all the details about how that works, but essentially, if you think there's a security concern at the municipal level, you would consult with the state police, and there's a way that they evaluate it. And if they believe that disclosure would be a security risk, you don't have to disclose it. The last one, I'll wrap up on that one, because this is something that comes up at boards sometimes. So if you go out out to bid, or you put out an RFP, those records, the responses to the bid, are considered to be exempt from the period you receive them until you award the contract. So based on that, you could have an executive session to review bids or review responses to an RFP, because they're exempted in that little window of time between when we receive them and when we sign the contract. Once we award the contract and the project and all that, then all the bids and everything become public. But if you're still debating, which bidder to choose, you wouldn't have to disclose those, or you could have an executive session. You could invite the bidders to the executive session, review the proposals with them, or something like that. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning with my contact information. But does anyone have any other questions at all about anything we covered or didn't cover? Yes. Sure.
Exemption. Does that mean if a student takes a math test?
So this is employment tests. It's not about like a test for like a school math test.
So in theory, or in practicality, would a math test, having been completed by a student, be FOIA-able? We have a thing at Simsbury High.
So with anything with anything to do with students, the first thing that always comes up is FERPA. So the first thing would be, I think you'd have to look at would be, obviously you can't get other students' tests. So I think if a student requested, or a parent on behalf of a student requested something like that, I don't think there'd be an exemption in the FOI Act, and I don't think FERPA would preclude it, because it's, student records. I would hope you wouldn't have to file an FOI to find your test score, but I think with student records, it's all really governed by FERPA, and I'm not an expert in FERPA, but I think there's a way you have to do it, and you submit some documentation, and so you can make an FOI request to a school. They're probably going to come back around and say, hey, can you fill out these forms pursuant to FERPA, because FERPA is one of those other statutes that overrides the FOI Act. Sure.
board or commission? Or is it the whole commission? Is it one person on the
Sure. So what I can say is, in terms of FOI, if something goes wrong, the complaint goes against the board. So a lot, staff is going to do a lot of this work. You guys are volunteers. You're not here every day. So it's very, very common. Staff is going to do a lot of things, help prepare agendas. They're going to be there at the meetings to facilitate all these things. But with all this under FOI, you want to make sure, even if staff is handling it, you want to make sure it's being done appropriately because, if a complaint gets filed, it is going to go against, the Board of Education. It's not going to be against the secretary of the board, who didn't file the agenda. It's on the board to notice that, hey, our agenda didn't get posted and, hey, we can't have this meeting because we didn't file an agenda. So, the responsibility is with the board, but you're correct that a lot of times it's other people who are doing this type of work. Anyone else have any other questions? Okay, so the last thing I'll just say, is, I do this presentation really for anybody who wants it. So, if maybe you work in town hall in another town or something like that, or you're involved with, I've done it for some sort of different organizations and civic groups, even talking more about, making requests and how you can get information. I'm always happy to do it. Really, I think the more people who know about FOI and they know how to do it, the better. So I really appreciate, all the great questions and the interest. And, again, really, if I can be of any help in the future, please don't hesitate to call or email. There are people in different towns who probably call me once a week with something, and that's okay. Even if it's just to say, hey, I think I got this right. I just wanted, confirmation, a 30-second phone call, to make you feel better about it. I'm happy to do that. So with that said, again, thank you, everybody, and have a good night.